Good morning, everyone. Scott Appleton here from Cartesian, a consulting firm based in London and Boston. I'm joined here today by Jonathan Lakin from Intent HQ, talking about personalization. So I'll hand across to you, Jonathan, just to give a bit of an introduction to yourself and to what Intent HQ does.
Sure. So pleasure to meet everyone. I'm Jonathan Lakin. I'm the CEO of Intent HQ. We were founded now nearly 10 years ago, actually. Been working primarily with telcos and CSPs and customer data. That's our kind of a lineage and history. And our singular focus is on helping telcos to be relevant. Relevant in many ways, but most relevant to their consumers.
Fantastic, and very much want to talk about personalization today, Jonathan. So, as with any customer, as with any business story, the central character is always the customer, and success is always determined by how well the customer perceives a product and the positivity or in some cases negativity of their experience. So, I want to talk about personalization and how that then can be used to improve the customer experience.
Yeah, you're so right, Scott. I think when we talk to customers or prospects, what we find is they're very focused on their internal metrics, and how do I improve this? How do I get customers to add a line? How do I improve my campaign responses and so forth? But really at the heart of it, everything does revolve around the customer. And what we know is that the customers are tired of the noise of mass marketing, really tired. Like, when you think about yourselves in terms of how much you want to switch off, whether it's, the number of consents that you get, whether it's the number of messages. And the difficulty with that, or the challenge with that, is most operators still operate in a mass marketing mode. Everyone is driven by quarterly pressures, and so the need to get out campaigns with millions in them is key, right? So that's what happens. People push those campaigns, but when that happens, you lose relevance. So you lose that kind of sense of connection with the customer. And so actually, when we think about personalization and how do you translate it, it's actually, there's a really interesting crux happening, because there's been a lot of margin and EBIT in the telco business for some time. It's masked the levels of response rates that we certainly see amongst clients in terms of those mass campaigns. They've been getting into a point where they themselves are saying these are hitting the danger zones. So the question is, how do you do something about it? How do you move to personalization? And we see some clients getting very ambitious and really wanting to go after one-to-one personalization, and others actually thinking about micro-segmentation and so forth. So this need is driven by the customer, actually by the consumer, who really is tired, and they're either through GDPR or CCPA just deciding to switch off. So switch off their marketing permissions. So you're getting this drop off a cliff, or actually they're ceasing to respond to those mass. So the only way to rise above that noise is actually to be relevant and actually to start to get at what we would call true personalization. And when you think about it, personalization has really been around since the beginning of the decade, so the last decade. So in the early 2010, 2011, through to probably 2015, many telcos were working on some level of personalization. But it's very, very different now. And what some of the big tech behemoths have achieved with personalization and being relevant to a customer are in a different level of investment and zone. And I think that centered benchmark around customer experience, which you referenced in your question, that is lacking in many of the telcos. So there's this gap, and we think about that as the personalization gap. And so actually being relevant is about crossing that chasm and bridging that gap. And there's all sorts of levels of ambition in the market of people who want to have a huge amount of intimacy and sense of connection with their customers, to people who want to go just one step forward than they were before. But there's a huge gap between expectation and what is actually delivered.
Fantastic. And could Could you maybe give some concrete examples where telcos are trying to address the personalization gap to then get closer to and more engaging with their customers?
Yeah, so we're actually seeing it seep into mission statements now, which is super interesting. So right at that strategic level, we're seeing people write mission statements that are, have knowing their customer better in it. And part of that is really there's this awakening to the fact that in a mature consumer market, you're fighting for market share. And it's not a market of acquisition anymore, it's a market of retention. And therefore, actually, how well you have that connection is really understood. So concrete examples, and if I just, with that context, start to think about that, it gets played out in a number of ways. So if you start to look at, for example, let's actually take three areas: targeting, operations, and the treatment of messages. Actually, how the message appears to you. So if we take targeting, what we'll see is customers where the people who actually buy from those mass campaigns are very, very different, diametrically opposed to the people who are actually targeted as the prime, written up in the campaign brief. So as an example, you would see people who are targeted in their sort of 55 plus, maybe with a slightly female skew, and the people who are actually buying, people who are millennials. And so you realize as soon as that hits you, just how big, actually, if you could be relevant, maybe you would have to send, a third of the emails that you had to get to that point, and you would be much more relevant. Yeah. So that's kind of one targeting example. Second is in operations. And actually, as COVID started to hit, one of our clients realized that, many of their customers were paid cash, and actually then walking into stores to pay in stores was no longer possible. And so actually, how do you start to personalize and create a customer experience where, with the means that they could pay, because that was very different in this is different market, and there weren't the normal payment mechanisms that you would usually expect. So being able to know which was likely to be the most effective payment mechanism for a customer over something else actually made a massive shift to their operating business, because they were able to handle that transition from much of their customer base paying in cash to very little of their customer base paying in cash, really in the space of 1 or 2 months. And so that's a sort of operational example. But I know, in our previous backgrounds, we've worked on quality of service, right? So quality of service for customers is an incredible, you can move from a high level metric to really understanding how do you or me experience that quality of service, right? That's very different to a generic NPS score, right? If I actually understand how my service has impacted me versus you, that's totally different. The third I would call out is message treatment. Message treatment is, the images and the words that might come to you being different to the words that might come to me. And there's something interesting in that. Most brands tend to think, well, I'm the brand, and because typically as a telco, I'm a large name in my respective market, actually, I want to maintain my brand presence and send that. But really, if we go back to our consumer thread at the beginning, that link, consumers listen for and hear the language that they are familiar with, and don't hear the language that they're unfamiliar with. So if you want to reach someone, you need to talk to someone in their language, not in your language. Of course, you have to take care of kind of brand guidelines and so forth. But the reality is how someone interprets what you say can be very different. And so I've tried to sort of tier the kind of the operating, the targeting, and the actual touch point kind of levels of personalization to get to that point. Yeah, so there's a good few examples.
Amazing. And so you can already see how that will improve the customer experience, positively impact the consumer. And I think you started to thread through there how that will also impact the telco operator, for example, themselves. Is there perhaps any quantification you could do of the types of impacts that operators might expect? Because I guess at the end of the day, they're looking to maintain that engagement of their consumer, but they're also looking to see that flow through to their bottom line and to their metrics?
Sure. It's a great question. So first, let me preface this. What I'm really talking about here is true personalization versus superficial personalization. So getting to that deeper level. And much of that today includes AI. Certainly what we at Intent do are very focused on using AI to be able to optimize that targeting and find the right mix. And for most people, ourselves included, AI is, the world is learning how to implement AI in the right way, right? Which means many people go in with a big bang idea. Like, actually, I'm going to get this amazing set of returns. I'm going to get it off day one. But the reality is there are a series of blockers that start to get you in. And usually those blockers are actually about how the client operates, because they're set up not to work in a world of AI. They're set up to work in a world where actually they need, rules and measures and checks and balances, whereas you're not trying to dynamically optimize for something. So how quickly a client generates that value has been a learning lesson for us. So we've had to go, okay, actually, we need to find ways that they can do something super easily to start with, that's kind of within the realm that they can actually operate in today, before moving them into another step. So what you start to see is, certainly around targeting and that kind of area and campaigns, the take rates or the sales rate shifting. It could be 7%, could be 27%, could be 67%. So there's actually improvements and increases, but you see almost every customer sees an increase in engagement, so in open rates and engagement, and ultimately in sales. But what we find is that the people who actually convert at those different levels, whether the opens or the reads or the buys, are actually different audiences. They're different types of people. So there are people who browse, and there are people who actually are there to have a look, right, as opposed to buy. And so knowing and understanding those is actually where the value generates from. So that's that's one set of examples, but they really, you can take that into, you think about all of the big measures. You can start to think about improving churn rates, not at the high level of a simple churn rate, but you can start to understand who's churning. When you think about how to apply personalization in a privacy safe way, and I'll talk more about privacy because it's one of the big blockers to using the data here. But if you can find the solutions to those, you can start to actually address some of the fundamental trust issues that exist. And that again allows you to use data to identify someone who might churn a month, 2 months earlier than you would otherwise do. So instead of being very reactive at the point of churn, you can actually start to either take someone on a customer journey, or to figure out actually what's the optimal points that actually will prevent churn for that specific customer. And so what I'm really trying to articulate is that this is much more nuanced than a simple, I can improve the top deciles of your churn model by X. Right, you can, right? Those are all possibilities out of personalization, but really it's a much more nuanced question of actually, how do you really attend to the issue of retention? So that's hopefully that gives you some flavor, but significant, percentage increases across those.
Definitely, and I guess with something like churn, it only takes a very small movement of the needle to have a very large impact in financial impact for.
That's right.
So we're talking basis points can translate to something fairly significant. So you talked through there machine learning and AI. We do some work in that space as well, working with telcos. And I guess a lot of the difficulties we often encounter is curating an initial data set that can then be consumed and to start delivering value. Could you talk through the types of data that you're using? Because I guess this must touch across the operator stacks.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let me talk about it, and then maybe you can share some of your examples too, Scott. Your curation point is a good one. So one of our strong focuses is on behavioral data. That's the actions customer take. So we're very focused on not what customers say, although that's useful too, but actually on what customers do. And so when you think about the different types of customer data, of what customers do, it could be simple things like interaction with their apps or with the websites of that telco, but also their weblog data, their mobile weblog data, or their CDRs. Now, as soon as you touch that kind of sensitive data, privacy becomes a huge issue. So we've actually had to develop around that solves, and we have this notion of a marketing twin that separates personal data using anonymized data to create a twin, something that looks like you but is not you, hasn't used necessarily your personal data unless you've specifically opted in. And that kind of marketing twin is a way to abstract those. But to get to that data, to get to that level of abstraction, we have to go through, certainly in our case, and if I take the weblogs, an intense amount of curation. That data often is very voluminous. In some of our clients, trillions of rows of data, very noisy, but the richest possible data you could possibly get, because it's those customer actions. So what we want to find and are looking for is those patterns. So predictive patterns across all customers, not individual, but across. So you start to create these pattern maps of individuals. Now that takes curation, that takes time. And obviously when we were talking about value before, you have to do that before you start, right? And equally in that, GDPR and other forms of governance have strong measures around sensitive data, whether it's politics or health and so forth. And so what we do is we make sure that's all stripped out. And if you're using AI to do that automatically and to seam those, it's much better than a person trying to do that. So our view is that you can take that super sensitive data and actually improve the privacy standing and trust of an organization. And most people don't think that. They just think, oh, okay, that data is too sensitive, or it's too hard. But the heart of it comes back to, how do you be relevant? Right? That's the question. How can you be possibly relevant? And the answer is, you can only really do it if you have access to customers' data, the actions a customer take to make that. So that's and blending that data together, which is, I think, also what you're talking about, is, it's actually not just one feed, but actually how do those feeds interrelate? And when you start to see behavior, and part of that is about exposing it and bringing it into reality, into life. And so one of the things we really focused, we never thought we would when we started the business, actually, our focus was all originally just around prediction and being able to predict and understand this customer. But what we found is we needed to show the visualization of how does that behavior impact a key result in a business? How does it impact lifetime value or profit or data usage or any number of different metrics? And that's where you start to get to the nuance of actually how these different data sets interact, because at the end of the day, you either need to deal with that in a programmatic way where you're feeding the machine, you're feeding the Pegas and the Adobes of this world with all of the different end user or touch point systems that are in place in their architecture, or you're making decisions. And in that making decision part of it, you want to be able to look at that data and understand the impact that has. And that's really what leads to much better personalization, because you start to get an intuitive feel around the data, not just not just a black box. So for many companies, their customers are a black box. It's super surprising how much that is the case.
Yeah, I think telcos now are moving away from accepting a black box solution, and they need to feel and see the methodology that goes into these solutions. So it's interesting that you touched on that point. So you've talked through privacy through these questions. I also wanted to understand if you think that there are any other barriers or blockers that are holding telcos back, because I guess in some cases, a lot of telcos, we find we can be pitching against their internal data team, highly skilled and able to deliver in many cases. How do you find that you work with telcos? What do you offer that their internal teams do not?
That's a great question. I mean, telcos are different, right? So different sizes of telcos and the medium to big ones are the ones I think you're talking about that have, potentially significant resources to apply to these kinds of technical endeavors and want to, right? Because the work is interesting.
Yeah.
And I think there are numbers of things that we think about really if I were to sort of pull one thing out, it's time to market, how quickly you can actually deliver something and be generating revenue or impact from that thing. In the case of many internal projects, that's a years-long endeavor. Whereas a company like us, and maybe the company you're in, we've already invested circa 40 million quid into the kind of the work that we do, right? In understanding those patterns, understanding behavior. And that's a sizable investment when you think about it. And it's not just the investment, it's that actually there's a real lack of resource. So the data science, ML skill sets, data sciences are hard to find, certainly hard to find at the right price points for many organizations. Many of the telcos actually have limits on who they can hire at what level in the organization relative, and that's one of the biggest challenges they have to overcome. And so one of the things we like to think about and do is how do we enable their own teams to really accelerate? So actually, if you can take a whole lot of the grunt work or the plumbing away from them, all of that curation work that you describe, potentially around, let's say, this set of behavioral data, and can we produce sort of behavioral features that their data scientists can use? Wow. Suddenly, actually, what we're helping to do is actually give them something that they can then actually do their magic on in a better way, right? So that's kind of part of the story. The second thing is to realize that the whole space of personalization is incredibly complex, right? Building a true personalization machine goes all the way from handling huge value data, huge volume of data, so data at scale, trillions of rows or billions of rows, through into how do you make that real time around a customer profile, through into all of the execution systems. You're going end to end with the chain. You're touching the entire stack. No company can actually do that. So you have to pick and choose. Where are you going to play, right? Because you sure need to play in kind of the area that you really can deliver value. And ultimately, you need to rely on people like Cartesian and Intent to basically provide a set of services around that help them accomplish their goals. I think that's one thing. There's one other thing I would add, which is that because we work with numbers of clients, and because it's getting to this goal of true personalization and relevance is for many of them are really a new thing, not the desire, but actually achieving that. Not a lot of people know how to do it. So it's a little bit like, how can you be an insight guide? How can you help them drive that insight? And so that's an attitude of partnering rather than attitude of vendoring. I mean, it's a very different thing because when our clients say this to us, we often get quoted as saying, actually, it really feels like you are a partner to us. Well, why? Because what we're trying to optimize is their results or their value, not actually our own monetization or anything like that. It's actually that mental mindset is actually one of the things that makes it success.
That's interesting that you say that partnering approach as well. I think that's definitely something that we find as well, where we have the greatest success, the strongest feedback, is when we collaborate closely with our clients and kind of are working together as one team. And it's also great to speak to you. You can see that you've got that passion for the topic, personalization, application of analytics within the TMT space. I wondered if you had any closing remarks for us today.
Yeah, the reason I'm so passionate, the reason I'm so fired up about this, despite the fact that personalization has been around a long time, is this idea of relevance is really profound at another level. It's not a, sometimes people think about it as, well, does that just mean I make a telco more money? Is that what you're doing? And the answer is so far from that, because when we think about it, we think what we're really doing is allowing people to have space for the things that are more important in their lives, right? By not filling it with spam and noise. And when you do that, something else happens, which is you start to send less marketing messages as a consequence. And when you do that, the amount of metric tons of CO2 that you're preventing to create what is a necessary sustainable future is huge. So the tying together of these things gives us a point where personalization is no longer about, is this a nice to have to improve my bottom line? No, it's actually about meaning in consumers, and it's about being a place where as a corporate you have a power to make a difference, make a change for the positive in our world. And that for me is what fires me. And so when I get up in the morning, that's what I think about. How can we help those large organizations, those organizations that actually have the power to make a difference, actually make that difference? That's hugely motivational.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Appreciate your enthusiasm and insight into the topic. And I hope everyone that's watching today will enjoy the session and enjoy the rest of the Total Telecom Congress. Thank you all.
Thanks for a great set of questions.